Heresy Alpha, Book 1 of the Marian Imperium by Richard Warren. Chapter 7. Alistair. Alistair raised his head from his pillow. Even by the standards of his previous birthdays, this one had surely been the worst. He had waited for his food so patiently, listened to the whole boring lecture about Julian the Apostate and St. Cassian, and suffered Father Zosim's censure just for taking one extra piece of bread. He'd even gone through the whole embarrassing ritual before all the friars, and what for? Had he known what he'd get, he'd rather have stayed in the piazza with the Latin and missed his dinner. He looked with hatred at the book lying on the floor. The golden lettering of its binding scintillated in the candlelight. Why were the monks so attached to it anyway? As if it really meant anything, other than their own enslavement. It was the reason they were all stuck in that stupid place after all. The reason he was stuck there. The reason he was lying in this dank little dacha. His bleary eyes lit on the tiny window. He rolled off the bed towards it. Even in the daytime, it let in precious little light, but he still enjoyed perching on its sill and looking out at the ruins of the basilica in the distance. Barely anything was visible, but in the last of the fading light, he could just make out the silhouettes of the statues over the piazza. He even fancied he could see the bushy beard of the first patriarch. That one was his favourite, the one the friars called the Rock. As a child, he'd long thought it was because the saint was made of stone. Father Zosim had later explained that the name referred to an actual man who had lived long ago, not just to the statue, but Alistair couldn't remember the real reason. There were a lot of things he couldn't remember, like how he'd originally come to the reservation, or where he was really from, or who his parents were. One thing he'd always known for sure, though, was that he had the monks. Even if there'd been no one else for him to turn to, they, at least, would always be there. Yet now, he wasn't even sure of that anymore. Still, there was simply nowhere else to go. He couldn't leave even if he wanted to. He was stuck in the reservation, damned to be alone forever. His eyes watered. There was a sharp rap at the door. Alistair nearly leapt out of his skin. He was surprised he hadn't heard whoever it was coming. The flimsy pine wood of the novice's shack barely kept out any noise at all. He could usually hear any visitors coming long before they'd even set foot on the steps. Bending down, he picked up the book and hastened to the door, rubbing his sore eyes and trying as best he could to hide his tears. When he opened it, to his surprise and alarm, the young Marian from the piazza was standing there. Alistair stood a full head and shoulders over him, but Alistair instinctively hunched to make himself as small as humanly possible. His eyes darted anxiously to the baton at the Legionnaire's side. For some reason, he blushed. The guard smiled disdainfully, mistaking his bashfulness for fear. He looked him up and down, the corners of his mouth drooping as he surveyed his flabby belly and legs. Alistair's freckles reddened. He crossed his arms, trying to shield himself from view, only then realising he was still holding the book. The soldier's brows contracted. His hands spasmed, and he looked to be on the point of exclaiming something. He seemed to check himself, but his whole body stiffened as he repressed the urge to violence. A tense silence ensued. "Lord Farnell?" the Latin finally asked in his unexpectedly shrill italic. "You are the orphan?" Less a question than a statement, he lingered derisively on the word. It was true that this one was new, but Alistair wasn't deceived. The soldier knew perfectly well who he was. It was just another deliberate insult. He pictured the guard strutting around the piazza, vaunting his athletic body like a trophy. He remembered how he had felt a few minutes earlier and became angry. "Yes, I am the orphan and my name is Alistair," he replied. He immediately regretted his defiance, but the soldier only smiled again without reaching for his baton. He had to be more careful. You couldn't just go saying what you wanted with these people. They weren't the friars after all, and if what the friars said about them in their unkinder moments was true, crossing a Marian could be a dangerous business. "You are summoned," the soldier announced, as all the colour drained from Alistair's face. After a long pause, he added, "By your master, the old man who calls himself Zosim, grinning as he savoured Alistair's alarm. At the sound of Father Zosim's name, Alistair came back to life. He steadied himself against the doorpost. They hadn't come to take him away. Yes, he said. I will be along shortly. The legionnaire remained on the doorstep, giving no sign that he was going anywhere. Alistair was about to remark that he was quite capable of finding his own way to the Apostolica. Only in the nick of time did he recall that walking unescorted in the reservation was technically a privilege, and, after curfew, altogether forbidden. In practice, it was a privilege almost always granted, for who cared what a group of frail old doddards were up to? Beholding the legionnaire, however, he saw the answer before him. He did. Grabbing an old woolen surcoat that hung beside the door, Alistair threw it over his broad shoulders and, furtively depositing the book, made ready to follow. With another smirk at the book, the guard led on. Alistair closed the door, wondering why, for the first time in as long as he could remember, he couldn't go to see Father Zosim on his own. Not that on this particular evening he'd wanted to go anyway. Still, it didn't feel quite normal. With gymnastic strides, the soldier raced back up the sleepy row of datchas which Alistair had descended half an hour earlier. Despite having longer legs, Alistair struggled to keep up. He was quite sure the Latin was making such haste on purpose. There was a chill in the air now. Annoyingly, his surcoat didn't quite stretch across his full girth. He attempted to pull it tauter, recalling another odd saying of Father Zosim's about the old patriarchs. Apparently, they'd believed the reservation's climate was the gift of the gods, but found Alistair's birthplace so cold as surely to have been forsaken by them. He wasn't quite sure what any of that meant, but on nights like this he doubted whether the old patriarchs could have been right. The legionnaire appeared at the head of the path, strumming impatiently on his baton. Alistair gave up on his surcoat and hurried on. Fathers Zosim and Vigilius were the only friars who lived in the Apostolica itself, rather than the dormitory shacks. It should really have been only Father Vigilius as head of the order, but it was also a privilege granted Father Zosim on account of his seniority. No one grudged him it, though, for the poor friars were not, as a rule, jealous types. He wasn't sure most of them were even aware of how mean their surroundings were, or else they didn't care. It was kind of stupid in a way, but then what kind of privilege was it to live in an old pile like the Apostolica anyway? As he entered under the portal's marble arch, he peered up at the enormous pilasters, whose opulent carvings were bruised by centuries of scuffing and entirely caked in pigeon droppings. Up ahead, one of his winged friends took flight into the rafters, upset by the legionnaire on the stairwell. As the Latin negotiated the uneven stairs, Alistair recalled that the Marians couldn't actually take the place down, much as they would have loved to. It was protected by ancient law. That didn't mean, though, that they were obliged to spend a single solidus to keep it up, and the friars, of course, had nothing. So, like everything else in the reservation, it was gradually decaying away into dust. He wasn't sure why, but the thought made him sad. Following the Marian up the stairs, he had as usual to thread his way through the collapsed roof beams and fragments of statuary. It might have been a perilous ordeal in the darkness, had he not known the Apostolica like the back of his hand. He noticed with quiet satisfaction that the soldier had his magic light on, but even so was clearly struggling more than he was. He was careful not to smile, though, when the Latin turned back to him at the top of the stairs. Instead, he breathed as audibly as he could and made a show of suffering. The soldier grinned and moved on. They crossed the landing, passing through to the old chapel beyond. It was the largest hall of such a name that Alistair knew. Despite the moonlight streaming in through the holes in the roof, little could be seen, but he usually came here during the day, and even in the dark, the old pictures on the ruined ceiling were familiar. It was his favourite spot after the piazza, another place he didn't feel so alone. He'd spent hours as a child just gazing up at the decaying frescoes. Many weren't visible anymore, and in some places, where the roof had collapsed in on itself, they'd disappeared entirely. He loved the colours and the men and women in them. He didn't know who they were, other than that they were probably from the old stories in the book, but he knew they were like him. Some were happy, and others were sad, and they kept changing all the time, just like he did, moving about in all directions at once, as if they were raging with the life inside them and just couldn't help themselves. It was all so unlike the rest of the reservation, and the friars, many of whom seemed more dead than alive. He stared up at the great picture in the middle of the roof, the one showing the two men touching hands. That one had always been his favourite. Father Zosim had told him the first time he'd visited the chapel that it was the Heavenly Father and the first man, though when he was older, Alistair doubted whether Father Zosim could really have known that. The greybeard was full of such old wives' tales. If the father had ever visited man, as they all thought, it was quite clear he wasn't coming back. Even so, it was nice to think he might have done so, once upon a time. The soldier stamped his feet impatiently at the far end of the chapel. Alistair had lost track of time and chided himself again for his forgetfulness in the presence of the zealous Marion. He shuffled on as quickly as he could, dodging the shards of plaster and knee-deep pools of rainwater where the roof had caved in. He looked up nervously as he finally reached the far door, beneath the fresco showing the end of the world, but the crunch of the soldier's boots was already echoing in the corridor beyond. Alistair hurried after him down the dimly lit passage which led to the inner chambers of the Apostolica. Torches blazed at the end of the dank limestone tunnel like campfires in a dark forest. Unprompted, his heart lifted. He had always enjoyed coming up here to see the old man. The same rush of warmth washed over him that always did. It wasn't a physical warmth, but something different, something like the feeling of returning to a place you knew you belonged. He remembered the book, and his cheeks flushed. Why had he been brought up here at all? Doubtless another lecture was coming, probably about the extra bread. Even on his birthday, and after such a stupid present, the old man was still quite capable of that. He always was. The legionnaire was already standing by the old oak door, tapping his feet irritably. He glowered at Alistair, taking his frown for insolence. Alistair lowered his eyes meekly. "Festina, homuncule, festina," the soldier told him to get along. Alistair hastily rapped the iron knocker on the rickety oak door. Homunculus, silly little man. The word resounded in his head. Wasn't that a stupid thing to say to someone twice your size? He fantasized about what would happen if he threw his whole weight upon him, smiling at the rebellious thought. Then about what it would feel like to be pressed against those slender limbs, so unlike his own, against those tight athletic sinews and the bristle on his olive cheeks. The door creaked open, awakening Alistair from his uninvited thoughts. Without any acknowledgement, the soldier marched off. Father Zosim emerged in the doorway, his black habit and the candle in his hand illuminated by the fireplace within. The image of the Virgin in the lamp and the blonde woman flickered briefly before Alistair's eyes. Father Zosim smiled, beckoning him to come in. Already frowning, he brushed past the monk in silence, somewhat more briskly than he'd meant to. The room was as always, with books stacked in untidy piles on the oak table and littering the uncarpeted stone floor. The many gaps in the bookshelves that lined every wall of the little chamber betokened another inquiry on Father Zosim's part. He didn't call it that, preferring the Latin word inventio. Something about discovering new knowledge. He'd never really got what the point in that was for a monk. Besides, the idea of trying to find something new in old books was inherently rather silly. Father Zosim gestured to Alistair's usual chair by the stove. Despite his best efforts to refrain from his habitual familiarity, he collapsed into it, making himself at home. He fiddled absent-mindedly with the spine of one of the moth-eaten tomes on the table. On its binding was written Codex Treboniani. Alistair neither knew who Trebonian was, nor what his codex was, nor why Father Zosim was reading it. When he looked up, the monk was observing him closely. He shifted uncomfortably, still frowning. "You were not happy with your birthday present?" Father Zosim asked, his verdant eyes smiling in the candlelight. Despite a lifetime in the reservation, the old Novgorovian had lost none of the characteristic frankness of his people. As so many times before, his honesty took Alistair off guard, disarming his conceit. He cast about distractedly, his eyes lighting on the row of icons above the fireplace. Most were of long-forgotten saints, but there was also one of the mother, with 7 swords pointing at her heart. Her face reminded him of the icon in his memory of the woman with the golden hair. "Why do you worship her too?" Alistair asked, ignoring the monk's question, as he fiddled nonchalantly with Tribonian's codex. "She's not one of yours, really, is she? Not like she is for them." He pictured the Marian's athletic limbs, which had surely carried him all the way back to the piazza by now. Father Zosim smiled, seeing through his attempt to distract him by winding him up. "We do not worship the Holy Mother herself, young man, but we hold her blessed for the grace that the Lord bestowed upon her," Father Zosim explained, without the least semblance that he was answering the same question Alistair had asked since he was a child. He was no longer paying attention, though, only pondering how best to contradict the monk. "Yes, but they worship her," he said, nodding at the door. "And that's the reason they keep you all here, isn't it? How can you honour her if she's the reason for what they do to you? It doesn't make any sense. Wouldn't it be better if all those swords actually pierced her heart, and then you'd all be free at last?" He could feel his blood boiling as his words ran away with themselves. He felt guilty, worrying he had offended the old man, and studied the table sheepishly. He pulled another book towards him, on whose cover was written Historia Ecclesiastica, and started tugging furiously at its frayed tassels. "The will of man is not the will of the Lord, Alistair, and it may often be that in seeking to do the Lord's will, man achieves the opposite," Father Zosim answered, apparently not in the least offended. "The swords that pierce the Holy Mother's heart symbolise her grief at her loss, and the grief of all mankind. And indeed, there is perhaps no loss so great in this world as that of a mother for her child." He looked at the icon sadly, then peered into Alistair's eyes, as if searching for something. At length he smiled. "But I fear, young man, that it is I who has caused you to grieve, for I sense that you were not happy with your present today, despite your words of thanks," Father Zosim said, raising an eyebrow. Alistair flushed, then grew annoyed at himself for betraying himself so obviously. If only he had been graced with the olive complexion of a Latin, like the soldier, instead of the pasty freckles of a barbarian. Not for the first time, the old friar had him cornered. There was nowhere left to turn. There was nothing left for it but to own up. "I guess, no," he stammered, trying to find the right words. "It's just that, it's not that I didn't appreciate the thought. I mean, it's just that it was my birthday, and not just that." He stopped short, and, to his own surprise, burst into tears. He tried hiding his face in his palms, but his tears streamed into his tunic cuffs. Laying his head on the oak board, he tried as best he could to disappear entirely. Father Zosim waited patiently until he had finished crying, then put a hand on his shoulder. "We do not have such things to give you as you want, young man, and I am sorry for that," the monk said. "I have always been sorry that we have been unable to give you everything you desire. But, as you know, our lives here are simple, and our wants and needs are few. Still, I fear that we've so much come to see you as one of our own that perhaps we have forgotten that, in truth, you are not." Alistair raised his head and looked at him mistrustfully. He rubbed his sore eyes. He felt angry again, though he wasn't sure why. "But I am one of you," he protested, his words pouring forth in a torrent. "At least, this is my home, is it not? I may not be a monk like you and the other friars, but I live here too, and I keep your rule as you do, don't I? I mean, I even eat the same food." Father Zosim's eyebrow rose again, and he fell into an embarrassed silence. "Yes, Alistair, this is your home, and you must know that we have, and always will, cherish you among us. And now you are a man," Father Zosim said, with a smile of such warmth as Alistair could rarely remember. To his surprise, there was pride in the old man's eyes. "Even so, Alistair, search your heart, and you will find that I am right," he continued. A shade of sadness entered his face as he studied the icon of the Virgin. Alistair reflected that it was true. The old man was right. He was not a monk, and never would be, even if this had been the only place he'd ever called home. "But, Father, I don't mean to say... I was very glad of the present," Alistair said. As the friar stooped beside the hearth, he looked older than he ever had before. There was something surprising in his face, too, something Alistair had never seen before, a deep, unfathomable sadness. It made him think of the well by the dormitory from which the monks drew their water. When Father Zosim turned back to him, though, he smiled, and in the flickering of the candlelight, the colour of life returned to his face. As Father Vigilius in the refectory, for an instant, the echo of a younger man was reflected there, and he became another shepherd astride the 7 hills, smiling at the morning sun. "Father, I want to ask," Alistair said, after a pause. "I mean, if I can, why are you so sad today? You seem to be happy and sad at the same time. Has something happened?" Alistair had always had a frank way of talking to the monk. It had always felt the most natural thing in the world, despite the very great difference in their age. No sooner had he fallen back into his old habit than he completely forgot about the book. "There are moments in your life, Alistair, that are like the joining or parting of streams," Father Zosim replied. "For life is like a great river, and our lives join and part with one another like tributaries of that river. So too at times the river waxes, and at others it wanes. Where today it trickles like a rivulet over sandbanks, so shallow that the shoals are visible, tomorrow it will flow rich and full. And just as it is for the river, so too for us it may be that unseen junctures lie ahead." Alistair did not understand, but listened patiently. After so many years, he was quite used to the monk's parables. "Such is the will of the Almighty," he concluded. "You yourself have just reached a great juncture in the river of your life, which now waxes to its full flow." His smile was warm, yet tinged with a certain melancholy. "Father, I believe there is something you wish to tell me," Alistair said, speaking his thoughts exactly as they came to him. "Is something going to happen to me?" Father Zosim looked surprised, but smiled again, as if the question were not wholly unexpected. Over the years, Alistair had grown accustomed to the Novgorovian's ability to hold 2 thoughts in his head at the same time. Father Zosim's eyes lingered on the icon of the Holy Mother, becoming infinitely sad. Alistair, too, looked at the 7 swords pointing at her heart. Gazing into her pained eyes, for the briefest moment, he too felt as if his heart were being pierced 1,000 times. He could almost hear her cries of pain, and, as if muffled by an insurmountable distance, the cries of countless other voices he did not recognise. He felt as though he couldn't tear himself away, but eventually managed to do so. The voices ceased, like the shutting of a book. The monk watched him closely. Alistair waited for his answer, even though in his heart he already knew it. "I think you have always known, Alistair, that one day you would have to leave us," he at length replied. "And deep down I have always known that this turn in the river of your life would come some day, though perhaps I have denied the truth of that even to myself. You must forgive the foibles of an old man." The monk's eyes had grown bright. Alistair blushed. "And there are other reasons," the monk said, seemingly unsure whether to go on. "There are other reasons, Alistair, why you may need to leave us sooner than I had hoped. I cannot tell you why, but my heart misgives me." For perhaps the first time in his life, Alistair witnessed something resembling fear pass across the monk's face, like the shadow of a cloud on a hillside. "For you see, the life of mankind is also like a mighty river," he continued, "and so too that river waxes and wanes through the centuries as it takes its course. It is, alas, the nature of mankind to every once in a while be swept out of its normal channel and scatter into many streams. When it does, it is difficult to see which winding and treacherous course to take, and it may even, without forewarning, become a waterfall." He glanced mournfully at the icon. "We have had many years' peace here in this sanctuary," he went on, still beholding the mother. "Yes, very many long years' peace, and happy ones too." As the firelight played in the old Novgorovian's eyes, Alistair had the fleeting sense that he was no longer speaking to him, but to someone else, to someone very far away. "Understand, Alistair, that the world is turning again," he said. "I do not know how or why, but it is the will of the Almighty. I feel it in my heart, and I know it to be true. Of late, my dreams have been dark. I seem to hear the crackling of a great fire, and on waking, I feel the heat of that conflagration on my face, as if it were blowing in with the dawn." The monk's face was grave. My hour is past, though, and I shall soon return to the loving embrace of the Father, he said, his eyes shining like emeralds. But your hour has come, young man, and my heart tells me that you will leave this place sooner than you know. Do not be sad, Alistair, for my heart also tells me that it is his will that it should be so. Alistair's face fell. But remember this, when the time comes, he said seriously. The world outside is not the reservation. The hearts of men may not always be as they seem, and many that seem fair may be foul. But so too, many that seem foul may be fair. Remember, always, that in all men there is goodness, though they may not even know it themselves. Beneath his wizened brows, his eyes shone like jade in the firelight. This is something you have always known, Alistair. So long as you see the goodness that is hidden in all men's hearts, you may reach them, and the one who sees the goodness in men may draw it out, thereby healing their hearts. And in so healing their hearts, he may also unite them. Such was he when he came among us many centuries ago, the great conciliator of mankind. He who taught us that, as the saying goes in the land of my birth, in times of trouble, brother ought not to judge his brother, for where judgment is passed, injustice reigns. Make yourself ready then, young man, for the hour is nearly upon you, the monk concluded, irradiating one final time before re-inhabiting his old self. All that could be heard was the spitting of the wax candles and the gentle crackling of the hearth, burning low as the evening drew on. Like its embers, Alistair's mind glowed with Father Zosim's words. He could hardly take it all in. Must he really leave the reservation? How would he get by, and where would he go? He hardly even knew why he had to leave, but something inside him told him the friar was right. There was a soft knock at the door, and the ancient oak creaked open. Whoever it was obviously wasn't about to wait for a response from the half-deaf monk. Alistair turned, fully expecting to see the young Latin, but to his surprise Father Vigilius was standing there, his face sombre. "Venit hora," he said. The hour had come. The bishop addressed himself only to Father Zosim and did not look at Alistair. Neither receiving nor apparently expecting any reply, he at once turned to leave. Alistair had always thought him brisk and remarkably swift for his years, but he had never seen him in such haste. He glanced back at Alistair. He did not smile, but only nodded curtly to Father Zosim, then left. Alistair stared at Father Zosim, hoping for an explanation, but to his consternation the monk simply sat there in contemplative silence. "Prepare your bag, Alistair, and do not sleep too heavily this night," he at length said. "For the hour has come sooner than any of us expected, and sooner indeed than I myself could ever have imagined. Sufficient unto the day be the evil thereof." Without another word, he rose to retire. Alistair moved to the door instinctively, as if this were just another of his overstayed visits, but his head was reeling. He was afraid, though he couldn't quite say why. He lifted the iron latch, but just as he was closing the door, Father Zosim called after him. "Alistair," he said, his beady eyes smiling in the candlelight, "do not forget your present." Alistair nodded hastily and, without looking back, ran out into the passage.